now. Yeah, hi Nick. You were my disabled students assessor for an assessment I did. I think it was around a week ago. And throughout the start of, or even coming up to the assessment, I was panicky inside thinking, oh my God, he's going to be an expert at body language. He's going to figure out everything. Even though there's nothing to hide, I was just having this paranoid thinking like, oh my God, he's going to think I'm a scammer of sorts. Does that happen often? Are there a lot of scammers
from sort of DSA assessments? Not that I've come across, but I mean, I'm certainly no body language expert, and I suppose my role is not really to judge that. I mean, I think as I would have said to you at the start, I mean, I think one of the good things about the DSA process is that, once you're in that meeting, once we're having that conversation, it's gone through the kind of approval stages that things need to. So I suppose my position would always be never to, it's not really a judgmental position, hopefully. It's one of kind of trying to just understand and support. I think like anything, the limitations then come because obviously it is ultimately government funded support. And I think the bigger issues are where the limitations of the support sometimes, meet certain students' expectations and things. But I think on the most students are quite either knowledgeable or happy with the kind of support that gets put in place. But no, I haven't personally known I've ever come across a scammer, but
okay, that's good.
Could have been, but not in my experience. No.
You were really good at that. At the start of the assessment, you immediately made everything so clear that it was just a relaxed assessment. It's just assessing what I need to be able to study to my full potential.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of. I think it's necessary to do so. What you're not alone in for sure is that because anything, especially like government, there are other forms of kind of support and things available, obviously societally, and I think it's quite an arduous process to go through them. It's a bit of a kind of microscope. Everything's kind of, it's not. I don't think it's not something I have direct experience in, but from speaking to other students, I don't think it's a particularly pleasant experience. I think it is kind of, whereas at least DSA is hoped and supposed to be supportive. It's in a specific field, supporting education, but I think the fact that it's called assessment, if anyone is told they're going for an assessment, it's never the most relaxing thing. I think they could probably change the language of it and maybe help people out in the... I don't really know why in the process it's not made clear. So, yeah, that's why the first thing I tend to do is try and make it clear to people that, yeah, it's not a kind of assessment in terms of something that is supposed to be too kind of arduous or anything.
Right, yeah, I can see that. What would you call it instead of an assessment?
It's a good question. I don't know, support interview or something. That's pretty weak, but if I had longer to think about it, probably something better. But yeah, I just think assessment is that, I mean, it's right. Your needs, basically, because your needs are being assessed, right? So that it's not inaccurate, and it's kind of that's. But I think the perception, especially when anyone's in a sort of government type support situation, if it's called an assessment, it's usually, yeah, as I said, you're far from alone in in the sort of build up thinking. It's kind of not going to be the most relaxing process.
Yeah, I felt it was so relaxing. It was really, really good. Yeah. Do you get briefed on like the stages to go through one by one, or do you have like a set of bullet points to just like tick off, and you come up with the rest of what to talk about?
No, not really. I mean, obviously, it's like anything. Experience helps. There was a point, obviously, when I, as I sort of briefly mentioned to you just before we were recording, about kind of I was a teacher. I've worked in education. I've worked with varieties of ages of students. Obviously, been one myself at some point in the past, and this job, working in the sort of university sector with university students, was something I got into about 3 years ago now. 3 years ago, so yeah, 2017, end of 2017. So I mean, when I first started, yeah, it was probably a bit more. I don't know, probably a little bit more rigid because you don't know what you're doing so much. So you go through things in a bit more. But there's basically things you just have to cover, right? I mean, ultimately, it depends on each student's medical information, how much detail there is. If you're doing, for example, like a dyslexia assessment, which is quite common, that's like, that's quite a common sort of need and students that we see. there's a diagnostic report that is, usually about 20 pages long. Other, aspects can come with that as well. Sometimes you just get literally a doctor's note that says, I don't know, suffers from stress or something like, something like that. I mean, and that's all you get. So in those situations, you're kind of having to understand things a bit more. But usually I just try and ease people in and just kind of, without putting words in people's mouths. I may have said it to you, I don't know, but especially if it's other things, it's not a medical process, right? So I don't need to know everything in exacting detail. I just kind of need to know the main things. So try and just explain that to people.
Right. Yeah. It sounds like you've gained a lot more advanced empathy with people to be able to understand how to deal with all sorts of different, the way the mind functions, which you likely had before from sociology.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's what you try. I mean, yeah, it's definitely, I mean, I think, empathy is a very good word for, I have a personal belief that I do think empathy is, it is something that I think is a very important thing, in terms of, obviously in certain roles it becomes even more crucial, but just generally trying to understand other people's positions as best you can. I mean, there's always a line, because obviously what you don't want to do is pretend or, seem like you're saying you understand someone's position without them having the opportunity to explain it, if you know what I mean. But
of course,
it's a fine line, because I think sometimes, when you work with human beings, right, and this is, I think, where 10 years as a teacher is a good experience. When you work with human beings, what you understand is that every single one is different. Like literally, there's overlaps and similarities, but every one of us is different, and that's where teaching isn't always ideal, because you've got 20, 30 kids in a class, and the kind of, you don't have all the time in the world or all the resources to teach each one in the way that might work best for them. So you try and hit a kind of middle ground that kind of hopefully isn't sort of terrible for everybody. And I suppose assessments are much the same. You kind of try and gauge from conversation some people, for example, want to talk and want to just tell you everything. And sometimes there's part of me going, that's great. I don't necessarily need to know all of this for my role. But if that's what helps and if that's what's good for the process, then that obviously for students like that, that's what I would let roll and kind of just converse. And for some students, they find it very difficult to speak about things. And for those students, it's more about hopefully realizing that and kind of being more sort of leading it a bit more, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, of course. And in a classroom sort of situation, if you let one student talk for longer, then the student that isn't so comfortable with talking might see that and be like, oh, it's okay to do that. Yeah,
absolutely. And conversely, one of the biggest things is not always let the same student speak and stuff like that. There's always usually in every class a student who would quite happily answer every single question, and a student who doesn't want to answer any question. So you've got to try and encourage the one who may not want to answer something and make them feel confident, that without putting them on the spot or just going you do it now, you answer now, whilst also not just asking the same person every time, because everyone else just they'll just answer it or whatever. So yeah, I mean that's what makes the roles interesting. It's not, the subjects themselves are good, and I was lucky. I taught subjects I had interest in. I'm interested in social political stuff, and the nice thing I would struggle, I think, with subjects like math, not because I have anything against them, just because it's a set of things that don't change so much. Whereas social subjects, even if the information you're teaching is the same a year on the next year, the context of it would change. The political situation in the world changes, so you've always got kind of stuff to, that's the kind of bit that keeps it interesting for me. And
right.
Yeah.
Okay. So did you say social maths?
No, just maths. I mean, just as an example of a subject which, is great. I wish I was far better at maths than I am, but it's a subject which sort of is broadly, and I might be wrong, but essentially it's the same sort of thing that you teach each time. The fundamentals of maths haven't changed too much year on year. Whereas when you teach kind of, politics or philosophy and stuff, the aspects may not, the actual stuff you're delivering to students may not change, but the context in the world of it will change every year, or something else will be going on, or different stuff going on. So,
right, of course, yeah. The way people viewed the world 200 years ago, I don't know how long ago it was, but They thought the Earth was flat, which some people do nowadays. Fair enough.
Yep.
And nowadays, it's so different. Like we are living essentially in a different world. If perception is what creates reality, then what the world was 2,000 years ago, whenever the flat earthers were about, is a different world to what we live in. I love philosophy. There's something about it that clicked something inside of me. I got obsessed with it a few years ago. Man, it's such a fascinating subject. When you're like looking at these different timescales, have you noticed a huge change from like 100 years ago to nowadays? The main philosophical differences, whether it's feminism.
Yeah, I mean, the differences. I mean, I honestly think the difference up to a point is that, to me, I think the most significant difference is that people used to, because probably of, lots of factors, but technology, distraction, etc. I think people used to stop and think about the world, the self, the meaning of it all more than perhaps we do now. I'm not saying people don't, but less people do, because there's TV to watch, or there's games to play, or there's we've just got more like leisure time. We can go out and play golf or whatever it is someone does. Like there's just stuff that kind of I don't think people just stop and think about things as much as they used to. So the sort of classical philosophy obviously is from the kind of ancient Greek time, and I'm sure before, but until it was all written down, we haven't got it. So the Greeks were the first lot to really sort of write it down. Like the Norse, the Vikings and everything, they had great philosophy and religion and gods and stuff like that, but they didn't write any of it down. So it was all kind of just through word of mouth. So you end up just the things that have survived are the peoples that wrote them down. Large, that's like the Greeks first, and then people built upon that, really. But I mean, it's fascinating how applicable stuff written by Aristotle, Plato, all that kind of stuff 2,000 years ago is still bang on the money today with all the advances and changes. It's still like not everything. I wouldn't stress that, but so much of it is still kind of just pretty right on. Yeah.
Oh, so the major. How long ago was Plato? Do you know?
God. See, if I was actually teaching this, I'd be able to tell you straight away, but I have the kind of brain that forgets. Easily sort of 2,000 years ago, yeah.
Oh my God.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and the major concepts of how they view reality are the same.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's still, a lot, I think applicable. You always have to, kind of update, the kind of concept. But I think, foundationally, human beings in some ways, foundationally, probably haven't changed that much. There's loads. Gosh, again, like if it was all like as I said, this is just. I can feel like a fraud sometimes because I'm one of these people that if I haven't done something for a number of years, like honestly, it just goes out of my brain. But if you refresh yourself, you kind of remember it all. It's like, obviously, if I was fresh out of teaching a syllabus, there'd be lots of things just right on the top of my mind. Probably I could pull out as good examples. But I mean, so Plato was talking about, for example, just stuff like, is there such a thing as as an altruistic act? Like, is it possible to do anything that isn't in your self-interest? Like, can a human being make one decision that is, that isn't in their self-interest? And it's like, without being sort of depressing about it, it's quite hard to actually think of examples of things that any of us do that are truly, don't have some aspect of our self-interest attached to it. So. Is a human being fundamentally selfish? Is a human being fundamentally selfish? But so that what you said about philosophy as a teacher is probably my favorite subject because it's the most kind of conceptual. It's the one but it's also the one you can kind of get most lost down rabbit holes with, or students are just not. It would really depend. Philosophy would really depend on the class you had. If you had a group of like students who really went with it and got into it, you could have fantastic time with the subject, but if you got people who just really didn't engage in the same way, they're not willing to, it's not quite the same thing. It's not quite as an enjoyable subject to teach. But most of the time I'd say, and that's obviously my role as well to get that. But yeah, most of the time I think people were really into it and kind of, but it does, it can lead to a few rabbit holes, which are not, not always, they can be good fun up to a point, but you can go round and round circles with philosophy, but it's a good subject, great subject.
Right, of course, yeah. And philosophy is one of those subjects that you kind of need to discuss, I suppose, to be able to really enjoy it. If you're just telling a bunch of people, like, this is exactly the way it is, like, let's say you pick up a stick and then what causes the other end of the stick to move, you need to look deeper into it. There's all these different philosophies and you're just telling them that, fair enough, it's just a stick, mate. But if they're actually interested, they're bouncing ideas off and going deep into it, like, the stick is made of particles, but what created the particles?
Of course. I mean, I think, I'm a huge believer that if education can engender sort of curiosity in anyone, then it's succeeded. Basically, if you have someone who can leave their or don't have to leave it, but even just school, if you can develop curiosity, which can sound sort of a bit broad, but generally I think curiosity leads to almost every other aspect. If you're curious and things, if you're willing to learn, if you're kind of then apply that to a different subject, you'll always want to learn. You'll always want to find out something else, like say, dig a bit deeper into that. One question, I mean, I always had a way of saying it, usually if you open one door, like to something, it usually has like 10 other doors behind it. So if you want to understand that one thing, you usually have to understand 10 other things to understand why that one thing exists and or has happened that way or something like that. And that's why lots of people will just go, nope, tap out here because it's because it is, and I'd include myself at sometimes about that. But that's what's interesting, is trying to kind of work out what. I mean, I think when I was in school, history was what I was most interested in because it's the same sort of thing. But then as I went up, I got a bit sort of writing more sort of social stuff.
Right. Yeah. I feel like history is more of it's sort of the facts. It's the basis behind the philosophy. I don't know if you'd agree with that. So let's say
I think history is great. I just think it's so vast. And sometimes, I think history's got the element sometimes of kind of, this is what happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and I think sometimes it's. I'm not sure, especially I'm sure at university level and stuff like that, it gets more different. But certainly at school level, I think it can kind of oversimplify things that aren't simple. You know what I mean? And that's probably unfair. But I did spend quite a lot of time in the history department, and a lot of the stuff I saw was a bit like that, just a bit. And I love history, and I was big. I always thought history was kind of what I was going to do. But I think sometimes it's so difficult because with a group of 14-year-olds, you can't necessarily go into the whole history of why something happened. But, I always found, topics like slavery a bit difficult that they were doing, because they would just go like, slaves lived in a plantation and they would do this and they would do that. And I was always kind of like, yeah, but why? And then what happened? And, and like all the, sort of all the other stuff, which maybe there just isn't simply time for, but it's a bit, or you just take little pockets of time, and sort of say, this is, which is good, but I prefer the more sort of, the layers of understanding between sort of like, I mean, philosophy is like the foundation of it all, for sure. It really is. Like, philosophy goes through like all the concepts that underpin all of our sort of understanding of everything, really, over time. So that's why I enjoy that one the most. Right.
Yes. And like you were saying earlier, if they oversimplify the school system, then that's it. There's no more for the student to learn, and they may not become curious as to why did that happen. I suppose that's the value in history, as in the why, because that's where we learn from. That's how we prevent it from happening in the future.
Of course. I think the bigger, this is another, huge, rabbit hole with different points of view on it. But I mean, I certainly think over the last 15 to 20 years, you'll have gone through schooling like that. Even, I mean, I did to an extent. I mean, I left school in 2006, but we felt it at the time. I think it's only got worse. But, obviously learning is very much attached to assessment, exams and things like that, and that's where, once you do that as well, you can drum out the curiosity, because, I don't even mean this is a critical point, but, I had plenty of students saying similar sorts of sentiments to me, like, you go off on sort of more tangents and stuff, or discursive stuff. It's like, do I need to know this for an exam, sir? Do I need to know this? And if your answer is kind of, well, maybe not directly, but this will help you. So you could just see some students just like, whoop, switch off. Not all, but some students would, just because, and that's not their fault. I never blame the individual student for that. We now have a system that tests. I mean, I haven't been in the primary sector, but we now have like exam tests for 5 and 6 year olds. You have like tests for like 9 and 10 year olds. They do 11, stats at 11 before they leave primary school. You do entry tests for, as soon as you get to school to be put in sets. Then you have SATs in year 9, and you have GCSEs. And, it's an endless, it's a kind of endless stream now of assessment and learning outside of, assessment is not something that's sort of been prioritized. I think inevitably you get people who just want to know what they need to know to get to the next stage, which is understandable, but it's a sad societal thing because people don't get curious so much.
I totally agree with you. Yeah, it's entrepreneurs, like for example Elon Musk. He actually performed excellently in his essays, but for his future, he didn't need to write essays as such. He used the skills from the essays for emails, but to school seems to, like you said, it's prioritizing passing the essays, it's passing the assessments, but school, it should be a school for life. It should be preparing you for what's happening in the future. And and
I think I think one of the things that's always really, it can be, everything is really complex. That's the thing. And I think, not to go into tangents, but if you've seen the rise of kind of what's called like populists in politics, so that is like the Trumps of this world or the Putin or people like that, people who present very simple solutions to complex problems, right? So, whether that is we have an immigration problem, we're going to build a wall, and I'm not here agreeing or disagreeing with it, but it's a very simple, sort of blunt way of dealing with a complex problem. Like, why would people, and all that kind of stuff. But so you have, so everything is very complex, and in a school. Schools believe they are preparing people for the future because obviously to some degree things like exam grades and good grades and, if you walk out of A-levels or GCSEs, but most people obviously stay on to 18 or so now, if you walk out with 2 A's and a B or BBC or AAA or whatever it is, there is an enhancement potentially of your life chances. Not, your Elon Musk example is really good. Because obviously lots of people find different pathways to success, of course. But we do have societal organisation that value, jobs, opportunities. They'll ask you what your results are or whatever, So schools get caught in this sort of cycle of thinking they are helping students by prioritising exams. You know what I mean? So it's like, It's not like they're sort of, it's almost a big evil, but it's kind of just something that's, I think, becomes so embedded now that the concept of learning away from that doesn't exist so much, or for very few people do they get really inspired and enjoy the concept of learning because it's just a bit of a grind towards the next test or the next exam. And I think that's a sad thing societally, because you don't have, kind of goes back to the philosophy question, you don't have people just going up, a guy called Rene Descartes just went into an attic and decided he wasn't going to come out until he had worked out the meaning of human life. And he did. He spent weeks in there, and he came up with, I think, therefore I am, because I have consciousness. Therefore I am a sentient, conscious being. I'm not an inanimate object. I'm something else. Now, be a bit more obvious, but no one has kind of come up with that. So it's but not many of us are locking ourselves in the attic anymore until we've worked out the meaning of life. And I include myself, you're playing PlayStation or doing something else.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, if he'd been stored up there with some sort of form of entertainment and he wasn't just figuring out the meaning of life, he probably wouldn't have figured it out. It's like you were saying, the need.
I mean, he took paper and a candle, I think, but apart from that, I think that was it.
To jot down any ideas that he had.
Yeah.
Man, what a guy. It really goes back to what you were saying.
Yeah, but it's probably also like sort of insane. You know what I mean? It's like, it's like, this is the thing, the line between, sort of genius and, kind of sanity, I'm sure is probably pretty flexible one,
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it depends on judgment, it's perception. I could call certain people I know crazy and they'd say they're sane, and vice versa, they'd probably call me crazy. It's like Heath Ledger, for example, he locked himself in a hotel room with a bunch of Batman magazines to prepare for the role, and the role was fantastic, but it's possible that it affected his mental health.
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, I think it's literary figures, musicians, there's all sorts of examples, isn't there? Where to get that kind of, creativity is a fantastically interesting thing. I think most creative people are probably less straight down the line, whatever that is, than most people. I think most creatives have a certain streak of whatever you want to call it, but then that is probably what creates someone who is then or can be referred to as a genius or a great creative figure. Than, well, I'm just saying myself here, but someone who just goes through life in a relatively normal manner, I suppose.
Yes, of course. Yeah,
it's conventional.
I suppose then it's about mindset. It's about the mindset you have. So if you go through school thinking every single thing that I focus on for longer is going to change my future, then you'll possibly have a stronger future than if you think, oh man, I cannot wait to get home and I don't know, watch a film, whatever it is. Living in the present moment, therefore I am.
Yeah, sure. I know it's really difficult. I mean, my kid's only 2, so it's probably a bit young to start sort of imparting sort of much wisdom onto him yet, for whatever it's worth. And I think the curse of all parents is, I know it's different for different groups, but is that kids don't, I mean, I think you get to a point, thankfully, we might listen to your parents, but there's certainly stages where you don't so much. But it's about, but you say like going home and watching a film. Well, that's cool. Like if you do that, then, but like I think one of the things from when I was younger, I didn't really realize that you could build careers around these other interests. So say take for example, like I would play like this is my age, right? So I would sit playing like my Sega Mega Drive or like stuff like that when I was 10 and stuff, and no one told me when I was 10, or I didn't make that connection that if I followed this interest, if I really am interested in this, I could spend my life like designing video games, or I could write about them, or I could I like sport, I like football, I like motor racing, I like no one really kind of, and I'm not saying they had to, but no one really sort of made it clear to me. It's like you can build your whole career around you could if you like Formula 1 motor racing, you could have your career flying around the world, going to like multiple different races and hanging out with all these like people and stuff. No one kind of said so it's like I think it is about like as young as possible, trying lots of different things, but also trying out those kind of those things that you are interested in, realizing that they don't just even have to be kind of side interests, that they could actually be things. You don't have to go to school and then only come back. You could actually, if you really enjoy watching movies, well, work your ass off and then become a movie critic or become a director or become a like it's I think those are the kind of things I think kids should be emphasized more when they're at school, because what you get told is that's all your sort of side stuff, but study English and study history and study science, which is all good, like nothing against any of those things, but I'm not sure we're always really encouraged to think about all these sort of why maybe sort of what does interest you and how do you then follow those interests as you get older.
Right, that's true. So with your example of the gaming, and that you could have gone down that route, you knew at that age, I'm guessing, that game designers, etc. existed, but you didn't know in yourself, possibly.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously games have been around since the early 80s, which is more when I was born than when I was starting to play them. But by the early 90s, I was playing games. I mean, yeah, I suppose you would know game designers existed, but I don't think there was any sort of like connection necessarily to that something, at that stage. And I suppose like nowadays that link would be bigger because it's a bigger industry. It was a big industry in the early 90s, but like now it's like, I mean, I'm pretty sure this is, I can't quote the exact figure, but I am pretty easily Googleable, but I am pretty sure But the gaming industry is a bigger industry than the film and music industry combined, like in terms of kind of the wealth of it. I'm fairly sure of it.
I suppose so, almost every teenager knows.
Do fact check that. That's not a bit. I mean, you know, even if it isn't, it's comparable. And you're talking about like all of music, all of films. I mean, these are huge things, and yet still there is some element of a prevailing attitude that it's a kind of a hobby, a waste of time, or a distraction, or something. You know, I think it's obviously become so much more kind of towards the mainstream. Of course it has. Like no one, you know, if you say like, oh yeah, I was playing FIFA last night, or I was playing whatever last night, or I was playing Xbox or PlayStation or my PC last night, no one's going to go like, what? Well, you know, what are you doing? Like, you know, no one's going to like quit. But there's still something, you know, I mean, everybody of my generation, I know, not everybody, but the vast majority of people my generation, we're now in our later 30s. But we all play games because we all did from kids. Like that's the difference. Is, you know, it's come through. You know, I used to have students at school say to me like, I mean, this is a few years ago, obviously now, but it's like I would say something and know, for example, like what Skyrim was or something, and they'd be like, well, "You know what Skyrim is?" Like, yeah, like I don't know if you have swearing on your podcast, but you know, like,
oh yeah, go for it.
I wouldn't swear to a child, but like, you know what I mean? You're just like, get out of here. Of course I do. You know, I was playing games in the 80s. Like, you know, it's like, you know, of course we do. I mean, whether sort of my lot or the generation just before me, whether we're still playing video games in our 80s, if we get there and stuff, is you know, because obviously like 80-year-olds and stuff tend not to play video games now or whatever. Some do, I'm sure, but because they didn't grow up with it. But we'll have grown up with it the whole time. So,
right.
I'm looking forward to the whole like, you know, like the nursing homes with like, you know, sort of just everyone sort of playing like, you know, multi-league FIFA or something like that.
I can imagine it. Yeah, these the elderly like shooting each other on Call of Duty, etc.
But it should be, you know, in a way, it should be, because that's what, by the time my generation and, you know, I think a generation or so in front of me too, by the time they get there, they will have had a lifetime of that. It's just the same as watching TV or, you know, watching a film or something. You know, so it's just another entertainment medium. You know.
Right. Totally. It depends.
But yeah, but I think at least now with the gaming industry, it is more like of an industry. I think if I had said to my teachers in the mid-90s, I want to get into gaming, it was too niche still. They'd have said to me like, what are you going to do that for? Probably if I'd done it in the mid-90s, I'd now, not that I have any regrets about sitting here talking to you now, but I'd probably be a, you know, multi-millionaire computer designer or something else than what I do, because obviously it was probably a good time to get into all that before it really exploded. I was probably in a good position, but it was a bit too early, really. It was still seen as a sort of, it wasn't seen as a viable career, whereas now probably in school, if someone says I'm really into computers and want to get into them, it's probably encouraged a lot more than I would have been.
Right. Yes, of course. Yeah, it's I suppose it just goes back to mindset. If you have the mindset that this, let's say as a kid who plays video games has a role model of a computer designer, but he doesn't see that can be him, that like that could be me if I went after it. It's so much the mindset. It's the
sure. I think it's a big leap. If you always try and put yourself back in like your, again, human beings all different, so we're all different, and but if you put yourself back in that like 12-year-old, 11-year-old, 13-year-old mindset, it's not saying by any means that you have to decide. I'm in no way believe that people have to decide their career paths when they're 12 years old. But it is about kind of, you know, if you, as you do sort of develop interest in things, realizing that all, you know, I was never, it was never sort of emphasized to me when I was, for example, studying maths, that maths is the basis of kind of just like infinite amounts of stuff. You know, like maths to me was like adding stuff up, or if I needed to in the future, I'll just use a calculator. I might not be able to use a calculator for this exam that I have to sit, but in the future, I'll just use a calculator. You know, so maths, it just never clicked with me. But I never realized, you know, it's the basis of engineering, or, you know, like, you know, all sorts of stuff like that. You know, whether you were, you know, whatever you want to build, you could go and build spaceships with maths, or you can go and build bridges, or, you know, as I said, like F1 racing cars, or, you know, like that's all maths. It's all maths. But when I was sat in that classroom in like 1994, studying, you know, doing my sort of, you know, year 8, year 9 maths, no one was sort of making that link to those kind of that kind of usage of maths, if you like. It doesn't have to be a career, just that kind of usage of it.
Right. Funnily enough, Elon Musk actually, I watched a video ages ago where he was describing that if you got a bunch of kids and you got them to start working on a car, and at the same time they're working on that car, and they can't not use maths to complete the next task, and they're excited for it. They're like, "Oh my God, guys, yeah, we're building this car, we're putting it together." But in a classroom, you're just sat being given numbers. It's like if you got a kid and sent them out to play in a grassy field, they'd love the grass, they'd love the feel of it. They'd if they enjoyed nature. But if you got a kid in the classroom and sat him down and taught him without seeing the grass at all, just taught him the organisms, the biological, like really breaking it down of what a blade of grass is without ever seeing a blade of grass, he's not going to be interested. It's what connection do these particles have with the real world?
Sure. No, I mean, look, I mean, I'm biased, but I work with an educator, but I also, doing all the sort of society stuff as well. I mean, I am personally of the belief that, education should be, and I mean sort of state education here. I mean, I'm nothing against the fact that I'm nothing against private education in the sense that that's fine, but I also don't particularly believe it should exist because I think education is something that, should, and then using words like better and worse and things like that are very difficult. They're different experiences, but certainly private education has greater resource. Let's put it that way. It has greater resource and therefore different levels of opportunity. And I've worked closely within the private sector as well as the state sector, and there are pros and there are cons and et cetera, et cetera. And I won't get into the private versus public debate, but my view is that, state education educates 94% of the population. Okay. Only 6% of people in the whole of the UK go to private school. Okay. So that's a very small percentage of people.
That is.
All right. So the statistics of what those 6% then go on to do in terms of the most powerful and well-paid positions in society is quite interesting. It's usually holding between 50 and 60% of those positions. So 6 into 50 or 60 can show the impact. But that's a kind of influence and economics. I just believe that education should be the absolute. I'm biased, as I said, but the absolute foundation of a healthy and good ongoing society. If you get it all right, if you get education right, if you give as much opportunity as possible, then I just genuinely, I can't prove it because you can't, I'm not doing social experiments on this scale, but I just firmly believe that you will have the best chance of a better, whatever that means, but, a better sort of overall society. And I think,
100%.
and it's like everything, it comes down to it, it's not, everything's not about money, but money is a resource. Money is a resource that you can use to do things, right? So, like you're talking about the maths, you could teach maths in a completely different way, or any subject, but just taking one example to try and keep it kind of relatively focused. You could teach maths in any single way or multitudes of different ways. It's taught in the way it is, like every other subject, because it's the most cost-effective way of doing it. You get as many, most classrooms now are with, up to sixth form, and even then, it can be now with, I don't know what, yourself saying, but, in a state school is like 30 kids, 20 to 30 kids, even at A-level. And most of the time, those kids are going to go and take a paper-based exam, because that's another efficient way of assessing everybody, because, some students would way prefer to have like a practical exam, which do exist, I know, in certain subjects, or a discussion. Rather than having to go and write for 3 hours, you could have an interview with someone and talk about stuff, be asked, not even be asked like test questions, just have a conversation, a bit like you are now, and you just, tease out information as you're talking. There's lots of different ways of assessing things. Maths could be taught much more practically, let's go and build a car, let's go and build a bridge, all these kind of stuff. It's not. And fundamentally, without being oversimplistic, that's because there's not the resource to do that, basically. Yeah. So I believe it should be a resource enough to just, so that everybody, for those, what are we all in education for? 15 years, mandatory? That's a long time, yeah? So I just feel those years should be as exciting, interesting, etc. as possible. But I also accept we've got ourselves into a position in society where there's got to be some outcome for it that you can judge. Yeah, like there's got, that's the difficult bit. That's the difficult bit. How do you value it?
How do you assess that the education system is effective without getting them in a piece of paper, in front of a piece of paper?
Yeah, and some people like me might sit there and go, well, give them give 15 years of good experiences, and the value will be there. Yeah, like the value will be there. You can then apply that to whatever you want to do. But we have become obsessed societally with grades and numbers, identification things, basically. Like everyone thinks they know what an A grade means, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah, of course. We think that.
But it could mean a lot of things. It could mean a number of things.
Of course, yeah. The main thing that I think of is that the person that got the A grade is very sharp. They have great research skills. They spent a lot of time, and they're hardworking. That's my immediate thought when I think of an A grade, even though I didn't myself get A grades.
And I think you're probably right. I think most students who will achieve an A grade will probably hit most of those, if not all those criteria. Mm-hmm. But I think the difficulty comes when most students who'll get an A grade do so because some do it with a great deal of application and hard work because the system doesn't work for them, or the method of sort of assessment and teaching doesn't work, and they put in a huge amount. They get a lot of. Sometimes it's with outside assistance, sometimes it's through their own work, and then generally, I would say those students broadly, the type of things education asks you to do suit that student, or they've come to sort of suit them. I think that the bigger difficulty is the student who might, I don't know, get a C or a B grade or even a D grade or worse or whatever, but actually be just fantastic at so many things. It's just that they happen to be pretty bad at remembering and writing exams or doing that kind of stuff, which, you mentioned it yourself, the Elon Musk example, there are so many things you can go on and do in life which are not those, they might involve elements of those things, but they're not those specific things that education does so much of, Right. And I think that's the loss. I think if there's any one thing I would say about the loss in education, I think too many students it doesn't suit them. They don't get enough support and help, and therefore the time that they spend in it becomes, they don't get as much out of it as they could, and therefore society, we don't get as much out of those individuals who could have so many different avenues of kind of learning and ways to go. And what can happen is people obviously get disengaged with the whole process of education, of learning. It's not for me. I don't want to do, and that happens. And in my 10 years as a teacher, I saw that a lot. Not thankfully not the majority by any means, but you see it a lot, and it's always sad because you try your best, but that it's a kind of bigger systemic thing, that it's just there isn't the sort of the variety or the kind of different ways of learning that would probably suit that person. What would suit them, but there's just right. You try and do what you can, but most lessons you've been through secondary education. Most lessons you go and sit at a table, listen to someone talk, do a task, do some writing. It's okay, it's fine. I mean, it's what it is. But you get PE and all that kind of stuff. But it doesn't work for everybody.
Oh yeah, for sure. It definitely didn't work for me. I remember when I was in probably year 6 or so. I'd be sitting in classrooms and going off into a daydream about something, and the teacher would snap, Ali, come on, focus. And I couldn't. But if I was given, obviously because of the funding, it's not possible for all students, but if I was given a Meccano set and I was told you need to measure up this bit with this bit, you have to use maths, it would have worked for my brain. Suppose, is there a system in place, or has there been in the past, where students are asked what works for you? How would you like to learn? Do you enjoy playing with Connects or Meccano or Geomag, all these different toys that you play with your hand? Or do you enjoy creating sculptures, those sort of things? Has that ever been asked?
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that, I think there are, for all the kind of, I think, the problem that I have when I talk about education is I tend to get a bit kind of critical of it, I think, and that's from the inside, but it's because it does work for lots of people, but I sort of think I think the people that education works for as it is now would broadly work. It would still work for if it was slightly different. So I always try and come at it from, well, who isn't it working for? Because then I think it will work more for everybody, if that makes any sense. But yeah, I mean, education has got better. I mean, if you were in the 1950s or whatever, it's like, not only in this country would you be being hit by a stick if you did something wrong. I mean, that's like, well, that went right into the late 70s. It was in the early 80s that stopped. Okay, so, I mean, that is literally like, if you don't do what the teacher says, you come up the front publicly and get smacked either across the hand or across the backside with a stick. I mean, it's like, it's crazy. Like, to me, it's crazy. But I met teachers who literally, if they were able to do it, said they would still do it. Like, honestly, and that's a minority, like a tiny minority. But there were people I met who, I would genuinely always stand up for the teaching profession and say that the vast majority of people I met were very good and doing their best in a situation that isn't, not all, some just float through it, but there was one or two who were like, yeah, I wish sometimes we could be a bit sterner with them and stuff. And it's like, well, I'm not sure that's ever kind of, it isn't the army or something like that where, you're not training people to go out and potentially kill people. I'm not going to mention anything about like army training techniques and the right or wrong of it, but it's a different situation, right? If you're training people, to go out and actually like need that mindset to get engaged in a battle and potentially, kill another human being, which is something I've never done, and I have no idea how, but it's a completely different thing. Like smacking someone or causing violence to make someone learn, I'm not sure. Well, I know I'm sure I don't agree with it, but it's I'm not sure how it's conducive. But yeah, to answer the question, sorry, education. So they do these tests, right? So like students will come in and you do a test, and it'll say like I'm a kinesthetic learner or something like that, which means a student will learn more through like doing or like visual or auditory source. Like I'm an auditory learner, so I don't remember if I'm reading something from a book, but tell me and I'll remember it. I know I'm an auditory learner. I can learn from books, but I can also, if someone tells me something, generally I'll remember it better, or if I've discussed it with someone. But what that meant was it never translated, so we would get, as teachers, we'd get pressure from above to, well, make sure your lesson has, like a kinesthetic element, an auditory element. You try all these things, but at the end of the day, you can do your best, but when you've got 30 different individuals and like 10 of them like this and 10 of them like this and 5 like this, and you get all this information, you still got to just deliver all this stuff because they've got to sit an exam. And if you don't get through it, and this is just the truth. It's not how I would want to teach things. It's just the reality. If you don't get through all the content because you're trying to do it in 10 different ways per lesson, so you've sat in school, you know what it's like. So teachers will end up, there'll be bits and pieces of different stuff and they'll try and do what they can, but you end up doing a lot of listening, copying off a board, reading out of a book, writing stuff, because at the end of the day, you've got to get through a set amount of material that the student can then learn to sort of regurgitate in an exam. It shouldn't be regurgitation, but it often is.
Right.
It's got better, but again, it's just kind of like that goes back to what we were saying before. That information then needs to be put into a much broader system that's kind of actually, really thought about and really kind of engaged, so that not just, I don't know, you don't just get practical things in like art and D&T and, stuff like that, that all like subjects could have some elements of kind of practical learning or different stuff. But, and do shut me up. I'm sorry. Education is one of those conversations I can go off on, really. So.
I love it. No, it's always fascinated me. Since whenever I've been in education, just what can be fixed, what can be made better, because that's such a valuable time in a person's life, and it will set them up.
Well, like I say, 15 years minimum. It's incredible, isn't it? I mean, it's like. And it's not any 15 years. It's basically the 15 years from 4 to 18. It's like, like any 14 years of your life or whatever is a huge amount of time. But that is for all of us, that is our absolute like foundation time. Apart from those first few years we spend with primarily, and everybody's experience of that is different. Mm-hmm. But the time that we sort of spend with our parents in that sort of first, few years of our life, whatever that is, that has usually an enormous effect on us as well. It's hard to determine exactly what, but it does. And then those 14 years, I mean, it's huge. It's huge. So, yes, I make no bones about being an idealist in that sense, and I'm not putting it. But there are things that we spend way more money on than education. It's always said that it's one of the top things we spend money on, and it is. But that's because every single child in the country goes through it, right? So, like, of course we do. It's not like other things that, so yes, it does cost a lot of money, but
it could get more.
Without going down another rabbit hole, the big issue we have is that's like a big vision. You need kind of, sometimes at different time periods, you have governments who come in with big vision. So after the Second World War, that's when like free education was set up, the NHS was set up, kind of like, the benefit system was set up. Like all of these things were set up after the Second World War because that was such a harrowing and horrendous experience that there was the kind of what's called political capital to kind of drive forward these big idea projects. Most governments know they're only ever in power for 5 years at a time. So they do short-term stuff that can instantly be sort of measured rather than like, it takes, recently, I don't know exactly where you would have fallen in it, but obviously they changed like GCSEs and A-levels from A's and B's to like 1 to 9s. Mm-hmm. Right? That took 6 or 7 years to even like come to, from the idea being announced to that coming into fruition, if that makes sense.
Right, yeah.
So if you were going to fundamentally change the whole structure of the UK education system to be like different, it would take a very long time. It'd take a very long time, and it would be a kind of, probably the government that came up with it and spent all the money on it wouldn't necessarily be there to reap the rewards. And that's not a cynical kind of view. It's reality. It's the way governments work. They work in sort of short-term, easy impact stuff that when it comes to the next sort of election cycle or things, they can say, look what we did. Look what we did. This is what, and it's all sort of measurable and stuff. And usually what they want, the top figure they want, is exam results get better from the previous year or the previous government. That's what schools are measured on.
Right. And
parents don't help, and it's not their fault, right? But like Ofsted exam results, if you're going to send your kids, if you've got choice to send your kid to a secondary school, and I mean this with no hint of blame on parents, but one of the first thing any parent is probably going to look at is like, well, what's their exam results? And so schools know that, parents know that, so this is where we're in this sort of like vicious cycle with it. It's really difficult to break, really difficult.
Yes. And I think the assessment, it makes sense that the student gets assessed, but I don't think it should be the priority. The priority should be how they're being assessed and how they're being taught. Like, has there ever been a case where all the students that learn a certain way, let's say you've got auditory learners, and then you've got learners that are happy just copying off the board, writing it down, absorbing the information, and then you've got learners that prefer practical stuff, like using their hands. Has there ever been a case where they've put all of the practical learners in one section, all of the copy down? Yeah, have they ever had something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure to a degree there has been. Off the top of my head, not that I know of. I mean, if I was ever to go back into education myself, which is always something I flirt with, it would be to sort of, not to go into my own education. I already have a master's, so I would probably be looking to do a PhD in my next step if I did. And it would probably for sure be in some realm of education, because it's like, I was talking about the interest. I mean, I was always interested in education. I suppose you just don't know you're interested in education so much when you're in it, because, so it did make sense what I ended up doing. I won't go into the story, but it was a complete accident. I ever became a teacher. It was never something I wanted to do knowingly, but when I did start doing it completely by accident and randomly, obviously I realised it was something that was, was something I enjoyed. But it's also quite good. I think I've met a lot of teachers that one way or another get into it without ever having wanted to. And I'm not saying that those who want to be teachers, that's wrong in any way, but I think it's quite good to have a few teachers that actually never wanted to be teachers, because I think they understand the position of what you don't want in a school is absolutely full of people that loved school when they were there, because no school is full of people who love school. Like, you have to have people who understand that school's a bit crap sometimes, a bit rubbish and doesn't work. And you've got to have those people within a school who understand that. Not that they, but also just, because if you just have people who never had a bad day of school in their life, loved it, and as soon as they left school trained to be a teacher and came back to school, it's quite a narrow, it's quite a narrow view, and they tend to have a certain way of approaching students who don't enjoy school, as in they just don't understand it. Because like, this is amazing. Why wouldn't you like this?
Right.
Because it's not great all the time, like, quite obviously. But yeah. So.
Yeah.
So no, I don't. I'm sure there is. What I mean is, sorry, if I went and sort of did like PhD level research into sort of education stuff, I'm sure there's been stuff. But at the end of the day, human experiments like that, because that's an experiment essentially, is what you're talking about, are always loaded with difficulty. They're always like ethically, if not dodgy, they have ethical issues to consider, because obviously it's like if you took one cohort down a whole way and they didn't do as well, they probably would come back and say, well, hang on a minute, like, well, why didn't I get that chance? And, that kind of stuff. So it's,
right.
Social experimentation with large groups of people is one of the reasons, say, why a subject like sociology can be very difficult, because you can't, if you're doing like a biology experiment or a chemistry experiment, they're innate particles that you're doing an experiment with. You can, within reason, do what you like with them and change variables and do different things. If you're doing social experiments, you're doing it with human beings.
Yes. Yeah.
Different ball game.
You can't just...
And so, well, most social experiments, people have to volunteer for it. So you're already with a volunteer. So someone's actually said, I'll do it, and which changes them anyway.
Of course, yeah, that you've already categorized them into a certain type of person because they're volunteering. They might naturally have a selflessness.
Yeah, well, and they've volunteered for it. It's not happening to them unknowingly. They've said, I'm willing to have these different things. So at no point in it do they not know they're in an experiment, or that they're in in something that's being kind of recorded or looked at, and that changes the results automatically. It's like, as soon as you'll understand it, like in teaching, there's so many jobs like this, but in teaching, so for example, every now and again, I'm sure you've sat in classrooms, this will happen, teachers have to be observed, right? So like a manager or something, or your colleague will come in and watch you. Yeah. And it's like, it's never an accurate situation, because as soon as someone comes in and, if you're being told you're being watched to doing something, it's never the same as if you're not, being watched. Obviously, if it's like a situation where you'd always be watched, and if you're on TV or doing an interview, you probably get used to it. But if you're doing an activity that normally you don't have someone watching you, and then someone tells you they're going to watch and write down everything you say and judge you on it, it instantly changes how you do it.
100%. Yeah. I used to have a teacher in high school that would go off during lessons and have a little snack break. She'd come back eating a banana, and eventually they got someone to assess her, and she was in the class the entire lesson. She stayed at the board. She taught everything. Yeah. Clearly, one by one, like you said, it changes everything once they know. Like with these people that volunteer, they might perform extra better. They might perform better than they would if they hadn't volunteered.
It's that whole thing, participant bias, experimenter bias, all those things, they're all like really fascinating concepts. And if you do like psychology or sociology or any subjects that, psychology is slightly different because it's often an individual as opposed to a group, but, they might do it to lots of individuals to get kind of group data. But yeah, it's kind of, as soon as anyone knows they're involved in an experiment, it changes it. And as soon as anyone knows they're watching it, it changes it. So it's very, very difficult to do social experiments as the bottom line. So to actually get scientific data about social behavior, because we don't behave normally if we know we're being watched or experimented on. So
of course, yeah. It changes the whole thing.
So yeah, and I think they're too scared to do stuff like that. I think that ultimately they're too scared, about exactly the specific example you mentioned. I think ultimately they're too scared to kind of take, and I'm not saying that's not justified, but, to take different groups off and do things in completely different ways, because you'd have to kind of take a cohort through like a whole syllabus or do it for long enough to get like valid data. You couldn't just do like a couple of lessons one way and you could do that to get a gauge, yeah, but I'm sure it's been done, but off the top of my head, and certainly in any schools I've worked in, no one was sort of interested in doing stuff like that. It was just each grind doing things.
Of course. It would take too much money, too many resources, too much time. Another huge thing, I think I mentioned it briefly earlier, is mindset. Does that get taught at all? Of course, there's like the mindset that you gain as a human being by just being in a lesson and being taught by maybe someone that's enthusiastic. You might naturally just absorb that through osmosis and get an enthusiastic mindset. But has there ever been any lessons on mindset or for younger ages?
Yeah, and I mean, again, I think it's like a question like that. In some senses, I can only answer it from what I've specifically seen or heard of. The thing about schools is there's a lot of dictation to schools in the way they have to do things, but individual head teachers, individual teachers, there's a lot of flexibility. So I'm sure in lots of schools there is things. The biggest one in the school I worked in, or worked in for the longest time, was that you have like schools always have like broader themes that they want to try and instill in people, right? And they decide what they are, and so I would have always argued that curiosity would be that, and you can't make someone curious just by going, be curious, be curious, be curious,
right? Because
that's unfortunately but that's what the school does. So my school predominantly decided that students had to be resilient, which is fine. Resilience is a good thing to be, but
True.
Their method of doing this was literally just to have assembly after assembly on like the definition of resilience, or it's all like pretty basic stuff. They would, in order to be resilient, you have to kind of, I don't know, to a degree, fend for yourself, to probably fail at something, in order to build resilience, you have to kind of actually have certain situations that occur to you that actually build that, or, so I think, to directly answer your question, schools always have certain themes, buzzwords, concepts, or whatever that are beyond the learning that they want students to have. In my experience, I can't say I've seen it actually like properly underpin things. It's more just like, and here's your fourth assembly this term about the concept of resilience, or here's someone who, I don't know, went through a hardship and aren't they resilient? And that's fine. Like, that's cool. Like, you get examples, but it was never, let's just say it was never sort of embedded through like everything. It was a kind of bit more lightweight than that, I would say. But that's in my experience. Some schools may do it better, but yeah, most schools will have something like that. Yeah, like a kind of resilience or perseverance, or all these kind of things. Yeah.
Right. The way we learn as humans is we spend more time doing something. If I was to podcast 1,000 hours, I'd probably be quite good at it, hopefully. And it's the...
Well, you're talking about like 10,000 hours like techniques and stuff like that, aren't you?
Yeah, and if you're...
Yeah, which is, it's got to be... I don't dispute that at all. I think if you do 10,000 hours of anything, you must be fairly good at it by the end of it, I suppose.
I hope so. And if you're sat in an assembly hall being taught resilience, you're probably going to get really good skills of listening and sitting still. You'd probably get quite good at it. You might be a bit more mindful, but you're not actually going through.
You might be resilient to fairly dull assemblies. I think is probably what you. It's like
exactly, yeah.
But it's very easy to sit and be critical about this. Everything is done within the context of there's not enough time for anything, right? There's not enough time, there's not enough resources, not enough like actual thought to do it. The reason it's done like that is because any teacher that's standing there doing an assembly is probably because the head teacher or someone at some point said, "Oh, can you do this week's assembly?" And they're, "Oh, bloody, like what else have I got to do this week? Teach my like 20 classes and do this." And so someone throws something together on a Sunday night on a power,
Yeah.
That sounds, again, all very cynical, but it's also it's the reality of what happens, because if you don't, and not everybody does that. I'm sure some people absolutely, but more often than not, you kind of get that sort of thing. And it's like, I suppose I just wish to kind of come back, to my sort of main point about educate. I just wish it was there was like the time and the interest, and to a degree, because it's just part of, we live in that's the world we live in, like resource. You can do things without resource, of course you can, and you can be creative and you can do things, but most of the time, to do most things, the simple truth is you need resource of some sort, and time is a resource. Like time is the biggest resource, you can, even without like monetary and all that other stuff, like if you've got time, you're more likely to be creative. I know some people work best when they've got nothing, but it's like, without, again, saying anything too, lockdown at the moment is like working from home, currently got a child at home, my wife works from home, so you're, and when we can't really go and do, as we all can't, like wider things that you would do to kind of, release that. So I think, we're doing quite well, but there's not a lot of time, like time is a very, very, you're either working, looking after a child, cooking, I think time is probably the most important one, but pretty close after that is usuly money. Like to do stuff if you want.
Of course. Well, hopefully I get enough of that to be able to change the world. On the topic of time.
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, that's it. Yeah, and I mean, you've mentioned Elon Musk a couple of times. I mean, he's. I just saw. I mean, randomly you were talking about. I saw a thing in the newspaper this morning that said if you'd invested £1,000 in Tesla shares 10 years ago, they'd be worth 221,000 now. Which, and the good context of that was if you'd invested the same amount, £1,000 in BMW, McDonald's, and Starbucks, I'm pretty sure it was, that would literally have returned you about 300 quid in 10 years. So you wouldn't have lost anything, but I mean, they're pretty big companies, but it shows obviously the skyrocket of that company. Although I never quite understand it. Sometimes I read things like, Tesla's had like 5 billion cut off its value, or you think that seems significant, but then you look at it, it's still doing all right.
Yeah, it's still going up. Man, he lost like 9% stock from smoking some weed on a podcast. That's crazy.
Well, I mean, that's horrible.
It's madness. Yes.
Well, that's I don't know where that would be, but America's quite an interesting country with that. I mean, America's a fascinating country. It's got all that sort of fundamental, like, kind of religious Christianity stuff, but yet, they're the country that's like, legalizing, weed, cannabis, marijuana, in most states. I mean, Britain might do that before, but before all of that, you would have thought like maybe Britain's a more progressive country than America. They're very sort of religious conservative, but it's a fascinating country, but interesting one. Yeah.
Man, this has been such an insightful talk.
Well, I'm sorry. I probably just whittled on about education, so I'm sorry, but that's a topic I'm very comfortable with.
I could tell you know so much about it, and you've. It's something I've always wanted to talk about, and I'm glad I was able to talk about it with an expert to really get into it, because you talk about it with friends whilst you're at school. Oh, how can you improve this, man? We hate school. But to actually sit down and talk with someone that's been through it, it's brilliant.
Well, thank you very much. You're very kind to call me an expert. I mean, I will absolutely take it. Don't worry, thank you. But I mean, it's I think it's just, it's something I do have experience in, but I think it's, I think it's very important. I think it's very important. I think we don't always talk about it as much as we should. Like, it's always something that's a big deal, but it's just too big a thing probably to change very easily, which is why people sort of get a bit overwhelmed by the thought of changing it. But I certainly think the people who work within it are very good. But some of the systems at its heart are quite damaging to quite a lot of people, as well as, the good. And that applies, and I mean that for the kids that come out with 3 A's as well. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that just coming out the other end with 3 A's doesn't mean that was a good experience for you. Like, it doesn't mean you haven't got, like, scars from it and stuff, It's like, that, you might, but that, might give you X or Y opportunities, but it doesn't mean that you've got that without potential, there's a lot, especially girls, it's not exclusive, but especially girls, like, they put themselves under a lot of pressure, and it's not always a good thing. But so I think, I'm not expecting to see it, by the way, anytime soon, radical change within the education system, but I'd like to.
Hopefully, it's gotten better.
Well, maybe I'll take inspiration from this, and I'll go and try and do what you're saying, like make a change myself somewhere.
Become the entrepreneur of schools, change the world. It's possible.
I know, yeah. Well, I'd like to, but
resources.
Who knows? Maybe. Yeah. No, it's been great to have the opportunity to chat about it. I mean, thank you very much. Very good.
I'll just pop the recording off now. I'll just stop.